traffic light analysis. We'll have questions in the middle of that, but before we talk about accepting the stock assessment for management purposes, we'll do the traffic light review. So if we can start, Chris, if you're ready, go ahead.
All right, we're ready to start out. Just a quick note starting out, some of the stuff in the data sets and the methods we used for the spot stock assessment is very similar. It's the same stuff we did for the Croaker stock assessment, so I'm not going. This is going to be a little more abbreviated than what we went over for the Croaker assessment. Okay, so for the outline, just what we're going to cover. The assessment was using commercial and recreational data. We're looking at shrimp trawl fishery discards, another fishery dependent source, and 3 fishery independent surveys. The NIMFS Fall Groundfish Survey, SEAMAP, and the North Carolina DMF Program 195. Then I'm going to cover the modeling approaches and results, and then finally the reference points and the stock status. And then one note, we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into it, but the fishery independent data sets were split between, we used split indices, and they were split by age group between age 0 or pre-recruits and age 1+, which were the fully recruited fish, primarily in the catch survey analysis model. Okay, start out with the commercial landings. Commercial landings from 1950 to present have fluctuated from about 638 to 6,500 metric tons. Majority of spot that are landed coming from Virginia and North Carolina. And the long-term trend has been a fairly steady decline, particularly, and there's been a lot more interannual variability in the last 10 years or so. Landings have been negligible from states north of New Jersey. However, landings in these states have been increasing in recent years. The lowest year for commercial landings for the entire data set occurred in 2012, which was within the assessment time period. The shrimp trawl discards. Discards were relatively high prior to 1996 when bycatch reduction devices were not required, but did begin decreasing in the early 1990s. There were particularly high discards in 91, which was due to high effort and catch per unit effort. And then discards became relatively stable through the 2000s. And despite slightly declining or stable trends in effort during the 2010s, they actually have kind of turned up a little bit in recent years, and that increase was due to an increase in catch per unit effort. And generally the trends in the discard estimates follow the same trends that you see in the shrimp landings by the trawlers, which is pretty much what you'd expect. Okay, for the recreational catch, next slide. Along the Atlantic coast, this is from during the MRIP time period, 91 through 2014. Annual recreational harvest of spot has ranged from a low of about just under 4.5 million fish to a high of just under 25 million fish. And the harvest has generally declined over the time series, although not as much as the recreational catch has. I'm sorry, commercial catch. And the proportion between the harvest and the fish that were released alive has stayed relatively consistent over that entire time period. For our fishery independent data sets, starting off with the North Carolina data, and this is where we've split them between the age 0 and the age 1 abundance indices. Both age 0 and age 1 abundance indices for spot varied throughout the time series. They were both somewhat lower in the 1990s with larger peaks through the mid-2000s. The highest age 0 abundance occurred in 2008, and the highest age 1+ abundance occurred in 2006. For the NIMFS Trawl survey, abundance was high in the beginning of the time series, particularly in 1989, as you can see in the figure, and then dropped and remained relatively low in comparison throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s for both stages. Abundance for age 0 and age 1+ increased in the mid-2000s to the high point in the time series that occurred in 2012, after which it declined fairly quickly in 2013 and 14. And this was in numbers. For relative biomass was at its highest in 1989, which was followed by low relative biomass, similar trend as with numbers through the early 90s. And then a little bit more variability through the 2000s, again reaching high point, the 20-year high point in 2012, followed by that decline in 2013 and 14. One thing to point out for the NIMS trawl data was that the CVs for the index of abundance were relatively small. They ranged from like 0.03 to 0.31, and averaged right about 0.09. So the low CV values actually give this index a lot of weight in the model compared to some of the other indices that were used. And that was something that we actually examined in the sensitivity analysis. For SEAMAP, the index of relative biomass indicated that abundance was low in 89 and then began to increase a little bit in the early 90s. From the mid-90s to the early 2000s, it remained relatively low. And then there was a large increase in 2005, followed by a decade of ups and downs in abundance. So you saw a great deal of variability in the SEAMAP index. Okay, for our modeling approaches, we looked at the spot with two different models. The first was a surplus production model that aggregated indices that track the exploitable relative biomass, and then the time series of fishery removals in biomass. And then the other model we used was a modified catch survey analysis. Now, the catch survey analysis is a forward projecting two-stage population model. This is where we were using the age zeros and age 1+. You can use data or literature information that informs on the life history characteristics of the species, which is helpful for spot because they're relatively short-lived. The indices tracking the relative abundance of the stock can then be split into stages with similar life history or fishery characteristics. In this case, we were using it in terms of selectivity of pre-recruits and recruits of the fishery. And then the Modified-CSA used the time series of fishery removals in numbers. And then one thing about spot, particularly compared to Croaker, was that we really lacked the reliable time series of catch at age data with spot compared to Croaker. Just didn't have as much age data, so it wasn't as easy to run through the different models and how we were looking at it. The time series for both of the models ran from 1989 through 2014, and the modified catch survey analysis was chosen as the preferred model. Okay, now start off, our surplus production model basically showed that biomass has been increasing steadily since late 90s. 99 was the lowest point in the time series, and then fishing mortality was at its highest in 91, and then kind of was variable through the 90s, but then it's essentially been declining since about the mid-90s to where it's been in the steady state for about the last 10 years or so. For the modified catch survey analysis, both recruitment and post-recruit abundance were relatively high at the beginning of the time series in 1989. Recruitment remained high through 91, and then post-recruit abundance begins to steadily decline. Total abundance is highly variable throughout the mid-1990s, and recruitment did fluctuate quite a bit. Recruitment and total abundance hit the time series low in 1997, and then recruitment and post-recruit abundance then kind of fluctuate around it, but overall have an increasing trend through 2013, although there was a time period from 2006 to 2009 where there were some poor recruitment years in there. The 2014 recruitment was relatively poor, which resulted in a decline of total abundance, despite increasing the recruit abundance was increasing at that time. And then post-recruit abundance at the end of the time series has actually increased close to the levels at the beginning of the time series, while recruitment in recent years, excluding that terminal year, has increased to about half the magnitude of the peak recruitments at the beginning of the time period. For spawning stock biomass, it followed a similar trajectory as total abundance, generally increasing since 1996, with the exception of 2001, where you have that dip. And there was a slight downturn of spawning stock biomass at the terminal year in 2014. However, that estimate was still the second highest in the time series. So even if it had dropped off a little bit, it was still higher than where it started out. Post-recruit abundance is a larger component of the total abundance in recent years, and that resulted in higher spawning stock biomass than during the periods with high abundances early in the time series. Let's see, next slide. Fishing mortality. Initial fishing mortality in the data series started out at 1.06. It fluctuated over the next couple of years, increasing. Full fishing mortality then generally fluctuates around a declining trend throughout the time series from the mid-90s or so. Although there were some exceptionally large peaks in the fishing mortality due to upticks in removals in 91, 1995, and 2001, which you can see right on the figure. And then the static spawning, sorry, I got my notes messed up. Static spawning potential ratio, to get my terms correct, is an inverse function of fishing mortality. And so SSPR has fluctuated about an increasing trend, opposite of what we see with fishing mortality throughout the time series. Very low SPR occurred in the beginning of the time series. This was the time frame when shrimp trawl discards were at their highest, and also when those peaks in fishing mortality occurred for the most part. SSPR has fluctuated around a mean over the last 5 years of about 0.48, which was about 7 times greater than the mean SPR during years when the bycatch reduction devices were not required, at which point it was averaged about 0.07 from 1989 through 1995. So comparing the two models, the general trends in the population estimates from the surplus production model and the modified catch survey analysis overall were similar and verified the kind of the general dynamics of the stock over the model time series. The surplus production model tended to underestimate F and overestimate biomass compared to the modified CSA model. The fishing mortality estimates in terms of the different units, biomass for the surplus production model and numbers for the modified CSA, still had very similar exploitation patterns. And the modified CSA model appears to better capture the interannual variability in abundance and fishing mortality that was observed from the stock and indicated by the input data. And those different patterns may be due, at least in the surplus production model, was a bit more rigid and restrictive, possibly as a function of the constant intrinsic growth rate parameter. The terminal year of the spawning stock biomass estimate from the modified catch survey analysis is more reflective of the decline in relative abundance observed in some of the indices. And given those points, the stock assessment committee recommended that the modified CSA that's why we picked that as the preferred modeling approach to inform on stock status. Now, we did compare this to the traffic light, which is the traffic light analysis, which we're going to talk about more after this, was compared to the assessment results to determine the utility and reliability of using the traffic light to inform on stock status. The traffic light's currently used to inform on stock status annually. We use in our management trigger exercises, and then the modified catch survey analysis is proposed to inform stock status moving forward on an intermittent basis according to future stock assessment needs as they occur, and however that schedule happens. However, the traffic light still has the potential to inform on stock status in the future between stock assessments, so it's important to understand how the two approaches compare and contrast. The pattern in the estimates for the spawning stock biomass from the modified catch survey analysis were generally in agreement with the abundance metric of which was the fishery independent surveys for the traffic light. And there's no recruitment reference point estimated for the modified CSA, but qualitatively, the annual recruitment estimates did match up in many of the years with the young of the year metric used in the traffic light, but not in all years. That one was a little fuzzier. Let's see, where's my notes? And that wouldn't be unexpected in that some of the differences, for at least particularly for juvenile indexes, shouldn't be surprising because between the two approaches, because you get a lot more interannual variability in juvenile indices due to recruitment variances as opposed to changes in population. Now, the harvest biomass did not match up quite as well. The harvest metrics from the traffic light were not in as close an agreement. In this case, the matching up with spawning's SSPR, and then the established harvest metric from the traffic light does not include the discard information that was used within the modified CSA model, so it doesn't account for those removals. And the discrepancy there may not be surprising just because of the high proportion of fishery removals that the shrimp trawl fishery accounts for that was used in the modified CSA. So one consideration in improving the traffic light in the future would be to incorporate the fishery removals as an added metric. And the way these are treated, if you look at treat the spawning stock biomass that's above the target or not overfished level the same as the traffic light proportion of red less than 30%, where everything's good and we're not concerned, and then the spawning stock biomass between the target threshold of not overfished but the spawning stock biomass is still below overfished, below the target, as that 30 to 60% range of moderate concern, and then any spawning stock biomass below threshold or actually overfished, the same as that traffic light proportion of greater than 60%. Those, if you look at it within that context, those two approaches agreed about 65% of the time between the model results and the traffic light. So even though there were some differences, the status from the two approaches, you know, they weren't opposite trends. There were some similarities. And the traffic light analysis was a little more conservative in the final 2 years, suggesting moderate concern, particularly with the harvest, whereas the modified CSA was a little bit more optimistic, less concern. Okay, for our F reference points, you'll have to, oh yeah, okay. I was going to say this one has multiple slides compared to what I have on it. So you can, yeah, click it one more time. One more time. Okay, there we go. Then we get everything on there at once. The static spawning potential ratios were used due to the uncertainty in the stock recruitment relationship. So we were using a 30% SPR threshold and a 40% SSPR target. And the fishing reference points were based on fishing mortality necessary to achieve that SSPR. And so the biomass reference points would also be estimated from that F percentage reference points, so that our target, our mortality threshold at F 30% was 0.5, and then our target threshold was a fishing mortality of 0.36. And finally, we got down to stock status. The stock status, or the model, showed that the stock was not overfished at the beginning of 2014 with a spawning stock biomass of just over 19,000 metric tons, which was well above the target of 7,800 metric tons, and overfishing did not occur in 2014. So the 2014 fishing mortality was 0.249, which below the target of 0.36, and the SSPR was estimated at 0.507. And with that, we'll take some questions. I went through that awful quick. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we go to questions, could we hear Pat talk about the peer review panel report first, and then we can have questions about all of that, if that's okay.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The stock assessment review for SPOT occurred back in April. We had a panel of 3 reviewers with expertise in spot biology and population dynamics, as well as statistics and general stock assessment modeling. If we could jump a slide or two, those are the panel members. And they were focused on, too close?
No, turn your screens. See when to change.
Oh, gotcha.
And the panelists were tasked with providing scientific review based on the data inputs, model results, and sensitivity, and providing their opinion on the overall assessment quality. The panel concluded that the stock assessment provides the best available science on SPOT. They think the assessment team did a really great job of turning over every stone and looking for SPOT data and attempting a variety of different analyses, and as Chris described, a couple of different modeling approaches. However, they thought that the stock status determinations were uncertain, due essentially to conflicts in that the biomass was increasing in all the model runs, but the various assessment data components showed conflicting population trends, specifically the contrast between decreasing landings and increasing indices. And in some cases, the model struggled to reconcile the differences between indices. For example, the NIMS trawl showed a very rapid increase in SPOT in recent years, roughly 6-fold, whereas the other primary index, the North Carolina trawl, showed only about a 10% increase. And there were other surveys like SEAMAP, which were included in sensitivity runs, which actually showed a declining trend. And so the panel had concerns about these conflicts. Therefore, they do not recommend using the absolute estimates of population size. However, the trends in landings and surveys suggest that current removals of SPOT are sustainable. And I'll just quickly touch on the highlights for the review terms of reference. The first one to evaluate how the data were used in the assessment. Again, the panel found that all potential data sources were considered. A subset of data was selected correctly and weighted correctly, and the uncertainties were characterized in the appropriate manner. They did have 2 recommendations. One, to develop fishery-dependent CPUE indices that might improve our understanding of the fishery trends. Of course, we had the landings, harvest information, and some recreational effort information, but not commercial effort information. And the second recommendation was to consider standardizing all of the survey indices. The next TOR was specific to estimating bycatch and discards. The panel really applauded the assessment team in improving the methods this time around for SPOT as a new assessment and for Croaker, and that they used the latest and most innovative approach to characterizing shrimp trawl fishery bycatch through a combination of shrimp fishery observer data as well as the SEAMAP coastal trawl survey data and sort of calibrating that backwards based on when the bycatch reduction devices were implemented in the mid-90s. The third term of reference was to evaluate the methods and models in the assessment. The panel commended the assessment team in attempting multiple models, as Chris described, the CSA and surplus production models, and agreed that the catch survey analysis is preferred because it incorporates more of the available data. However, the panel was concerned about different trends in total mortality when comparing between the catch survey analysis and catch curve analyses that the assessment team brought forward. As I mentioned, the model also struggled to reconcile differences between trends in the indices and recommended considering an age, length, combined structured model, for example, scale models, to allow fuller use of all available data. And they also had an important recommendation about exploring time-varying catchability, specifically for the indices that are used in the assessment, that may help hash out some of the distinctions and disagreement between the survey indices. Term of reference 4 was to evaluate how the assessment characterized sensitivity, or did sensitivity runs and characterize retrospective bias in the assessment. The panel found that was all done correctly, and there was a relatively minimal retrospective analysis or retrospective pattern. They concluded the model was sensitive to index selection, and that some of the sensitivity runs using year-by-year total mortality, or Z estimates, resulted in a different stock status than using an average total mortality. And this was one of their major concerns about drawing absolute conclusions about stock status and numbers from the assessment. The next term of reference was to characterize uncertainty in the stock assessment. The panel felt that the assessment team did everything correctly there. And moving on to estimates of stock biomass, abundance, and exploitation. Again, although the panel does not recommend using the absolute estimates, they did have several take-homes that they were confident in from the stock assessment. First, that the abundance indices generally are stable or increasing across the stock's range. Secondly, that catch appears to be stable or declining over time, and that in combination, the catch and indices patterns indicate declining fishing mortality rates relative to the status of the stock in recent years. The relative status of the stock in recent years is better than the late 80s and early 90s. And that the shrimp fishery effort and spot bycatch magnitude appears to be declining, and the panel recommended reviewing the shrimp estimates, or the bycatch estimates, annually and folding that into the traffic light analysis that Chris presented, and we'll hear a little bit more on. And that final take-home seems to be most important because the shrimp bycatch can comprise 70, 80, 90% of the total mortality for spot. The next term was to evaluate the choice of reference points and the methods used to estimate them. The panel did agree with the SPR target of 40% and a threshold of 30%. Those are similar levels for other cyanids and species related to spot, so they were comfortable with that. However, again, the stock status cannot be determined reliably because models with alternative assumptions resulted in different stock status. And finally, the panel commented on the research recommendations. The first was to request increase shrimp trawl fishery observer coverage. Again, that's critical to spot and croaker assessments, and it was relatively poorly sampled. We did the best we could in this assessment. And also to increase the collection of lengths and ages in those bycatch fish. Second, to expand the collection of lengths and ages, especially for fishery-dependent data. and third, to organize an otolith exchange to develop a standard aging protocol for spot. And the last term was to have the panel comment on timing of future assessments. They agreed with the assessment team to do the next benchmark in 5 years, but given some conflicting trends with spot, especially in years after the assessment, to continue the traffic light analysis and to try to fold in the shrimp bycatch estimates into the TLA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, are there questions, or what are the questions? Yes, sir, Mr. Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just felt like somebody should ask something after this. It seems like things are at least not going bad in this fishery. I think North Carolina is one place that, very proud of the work that these guys have done down there. They haven't implemented measures based on their current research, but the work that they've done in North Carolina over the past few years, and this being the third year of their bycatch reduction efforts, should make a continual improvement in this fishery. But if I understand right, correct me if I'm wrong, the general idea is that the spot fishery is showing at least a stable, if not positive, trend, given that it is still currently a part of bycatch composes a significant part of its mortality. Is that correct?
That is correct. The shrimp fishery component of terms of removals, whether you're talking biomass or numbers, is order of magnitude above everything else combined. So it's very significant, even though the numbers have come off in the last 10, 15 years, much lower than what they were in the early 90s. But they're still there, and this was the first assessment where we've really included them in the model. We've looked at the previous two assessments. It was considered, but we didn't really have a good way to incorporate it in the model. So this is the first time we've actually been able to incorporate it into the model. But as I'm going to go over with the traffic light stuff after this, there are some concerns with recreational and commercial numbers that have been declining fairly steadily. So there are definitely still some issues.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris, in light of what you just said, the effect of shrimp trawl bycatch has been decreasing in recent years, and yet apparently we're not seeing a concomitant increase in commercial and recreational landings. I was wondering if you have any speculative cause and effect comments in that regard, or is there no relationship between those two? Thanks.
I'm not going to say there's no relationship, but they do seem to be decoupled. I mean, you're getting those kind of different trends. And one thing, at least in the shrimp fishery, if you go back to that time period in the late 80s, early 90s, overall, the overall effort in the shrimp fishery has been declining for years. I mean, you've seen a reduction in the fleet, and the guys maybe have become more efficient, but you see far fewer boats. So I would tend towards the reduction in the overall effort that we've seen in the decline in the shrimp fishery over the last 20-odd years, more so than, or it seems from the data sets, than something biological necessarily. But we're still, that's part of why we've been spending so much time on the traffic light stuff, is to try and tease out some of the differences in why we're seeing such a differing trends. Croaker, they seem to match up a lot better between different data sets, and Spot just don't track as well across commercial data, recreational data, and the fishery independent indices. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and of course I'm calling for speculation, but it sort of begs the question, is there an environmental component that is driving the stock that we're not accounting for, you know, with landings and that kind of thing? And maybe that environmental component has been depressing the expected increase we would hope to see as a result of bringing the shrimp bycatch under management.
Actually, that is something that we did discuss at the review workshop. Ken Abel brought that up numerous times, and the some of the explanations from that perspective could have been, especially given the time frame when the fall of the fishery independent surveys that we were using, a lot of that occurs in the fall, shifts in that kind of go back to temperature, shifts in when fish are moving in and out of the estuary to offshore environments where they're being necessarily subject to the bigger offshore surveys. So there definitely could be, and likely are some environmental components, but we did tease around with some of the data trying to figure out if we could incorporate, you know, environmental data, and it just we didn't really come up with an effective way to look at it, but it's been discussed certainly, and we've talked about it.
Mr. Bush.
Sorry, just to address one point there, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that might be looked at as well is reductions in effort in that fishery. We've got areas where we had exemptions that fishermen would fish on the shoreline, and those are no longer exempted. That's due to interactions with marine mammals, but there's other fisheries where we have other species that they can only fish for a certain amount of time before those interactions pile up, and that particular fishery is shut down as well. I'm sure that's got to have quite a bit to do with the landings numbers, probably not all of it, but I'm sure it's substantial. Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Similar to Roy's question about environmental factors, I guess Joe and I were kind of sidebarring during the presentation of the similarities of weak fish that we've seen in previous assessments, where there seemed to be maybe a bottleneck somewhere in the lifespan of weak fish, where we're seeing with this species the indices, for the age 0 and at least some age 1+ fish that may or may not be at the point that recruit to the commercial and recreational fisheries, aren't really showing any troubling trends, yet the landings have really fallen off, and especially even in the last couple years since this assessment. So has the stock assessment group discussed maybe exploring maybe changes in natural mortality over the time period, similar to what we've seen with weak fish?
No, we really didn't look at that in terms of changing natural mortality over time, the time frame of the data. And I don't know, I was going to say Jeff ran the CSA model, and I don't think of anything else that we necessarily covered in the workshops. Yeah, I just can't think of anything else that we, it's a good point. We did consider looking at different selectivity periods of the fishery and some other things that were run in the sensitivity analysis that we didn't really cover as much here, but not that, no.
Any other questions before we get into the traffic light analysis? Seeing none, Chris, if you're ready to go, we can do that.
You can go right ahead to that first slide there, Max. Okay, so just a quick review for traffic light. The traffic light management framework was established in 2014 under Addendum 2 to Amendment 1 for Croaker, and Addendum 1 to the Omnibus Amendment for SPOT to evaluate fisheries trends and develop state-specified management actions. The traffic light is a statistically robust way to incorporate multiple data sources, whether they be fishery dependent or independent, into a single, easily understood metric for management advice. And the name simply comes from assigning different colors, red, yellow, and green, to categorize relative levels of indicators on the condition of either the fishery or the population or whatever metric you're going to use. And then state-specified management action would be initiated when the proportion of red in the index exceeds the specified thresholds, 30% or 60%, for both harvest and abundance, over 3 consecutive years for Croaker and 2 consecutive years for Spot. And that would be all the indices, not just 1 or 2 of them. All right, next slide. Okay, I'm going to start off and talk about Croaker first, and then we'll cover Spot. The Croaker traffic light uses a 1996 to 2008 reference period, which is based on the time frame from the 2010 stock assessment data. The indices in the traffic light included both commercial and recreational harvest, as well as 4 fishery independent surveys: the NIMS Fall Groundfish Survey, the VIMS Trawl Survey, North Carolina DMF Program 195 Survey, and then the SEAMAP Survey in the southeast. Okay, for the harvest here, the traffic light, and I'm going to cover each of the, look at them individually and then show you the composite. The traffic light for the commercial landings has been above 30% every year since 2011, and this was actually the 4th year in a row where landings were, that red proportion was above 30%, and has been above 30% since 2011. And would have tripped at those 3 consecutive levels from 3 consecutive years rather, from 2013 through 2016. The bottom one, the recreational harvest level, in 2015 was among one of the lowest annual harvest levels in the entire time series, and 2016 was actually the lowest recreational harvest in the entire data series. That's going from 1981. The red proportion in the recreational index was 54% in 2015 and just under 61% in 2016, and would have been the 2nd consecutive year where that index had tripped. Again, this having to trip, have that level for 3 consecutive years. Now the composite index, for the 2 combined, the red proportions have been above 30% since 2011, with the index tripping from 2013 through 2016. And the harvest composite index would indicate, or certainly would, doesn't necessarily indicate directly by itself that a management response is necessary, but it certainly is cause for concern. And the important trend to point out is a decline in both commercial and recreational landings that has been occurring for Atlantic croaker. All right, for the fishery independent surveys, the NIP survey, which is the top one, we actually saw an increase in 2015. Actually, I'm covering both 2015 and 16 with a croaker here because we didn't run a traffic light assessment in last year because we were in the midst of the stock assessment. But it showed an increase in 2015 and it declined a little bit in 2016. But there was still no red in the index, so we were staying above the long-term mean, which it's been above since 2011. And then the SEAMAP index also increased in 2015 and then declined a little bit in 2016. The index values remained above the long-term mean for both years, which is why you've got that yellow-green proportion color range. And there was no red in the traffic light for SEAMAP. SEAMAP, you have to go all the way back to the mid-90s, mid to late 90s before you getting those low levels. The composite index showed higher proportions of green in 2015 than 2016. mainly because of the increases in both NIMS as well as SEAMAP index. However, they did stay above the long-term mean of that target threshold for the last couple of years. So we're seeing an example of what we've been talking about with this kind of decoupling, what we're seeing in the fishery-dependent metrics versus what we're seeing in the fishery-independent surveys. The juvenile fish, which would be, this is the two surveys that we're using for that were the North Carolina index as well as the VIMS index. North Carolina index declined in 2015, increased slightly in 2016, but didn't drop below, also did not drop below the long-term mean for the data series, which is why we've still got yellow and proportions of green in the index. The traffic light does indicate declining index values because you're seeing progressive decreasing in the proportion of green in the index, which is heading back towards long-term mean or below it. However, it's still above, and that's going from its peak value in 2012. The VIMS index increased significantly in 2015, going from 2014. It went up like 1,600%. But 2014 was one of the lowest years in that particular index. And then it declined a little bit again in 2016. But the index value was still above the long-term mean for both 2015 and 16, and hasn't had 3 consecutive years above 30% since 2008. With these juvenile indices, you're going to get a much more high degree of variability going from year to year compared to the adult surveys typically. And then for the composite index, the juvenile composite traffic light didn't have any red for either 2015 or 16, and so it did not trip. The juvenile, it didn't trip in either year. And then, as I said, that high annual variability in the different color proportions is generally a characteristic more of changes in recruitment levels versus changes in population trends. So to sum up the Croaker stuff, the harvest composite traffic light did trip in both 2015 and 16. However, the abundance traffic light composite show the opposite trend with increasing abundance, neither of any of those being above that red percentage threshold. And so with only the harvest traffic light tripping and not either of the fishery independent composites, management action is not required under Amendment 2. However, those discrepancies between what is happening in the harvest index and not seeing similar trends in the abundance indices does warrant further study, which is what we've been looking into. Likely explanations for that include differing size and age structure in the sample populations, regional differences, or temporal shifts in movement patterns between inshore and offshore, and that timing that's involved, and that could be that indirectly that could be some type of environmental variable. So we've begun, the Croaker TC has begun some preliminary investigation into using some age partitioned traffic light analysis, which we're going to cover a little bit after this, to see if we could get better clarification of and synchrony between the indices to maybe help us see what's going on better. And that is it for the Croaker traffic light. And we can just continue on. Okay, so I'll go to the next slide, which is, now we're going to talk about SPOT. SPOT uses a 1989 to 2012 reference period, which was based on available data sets. And again, it triggers if 2 consecutive years of red proportions are greater than 30%. One note, with the recent completion of the SPOT stock assessment, in addition to looking at the age proportion or age partition traffic light, one of the things we may end up looking at is examining the reference time period depending on what data sets are being used and if we incorporate any more. But just like with the Croaker, the indexes used are both commercial and recreational harvest, as well as 3 fishery independent monitoring surveys, the NIMS Fall Groundfish Survey, the SEAMAP Survey, and then the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Juvenile Fish Survey, which was used strictly to look at age 0 spot. Okay, for the harvest indices, commercial landings for spot in the Atlantic coast declined 70%, going from 2016 to 2015. Total annual landings have declined 90.7% since 2004 to 2016. So the commercial landings in 2016 represent the lowest annual landings for spot commercially in the entire time series. That goes back to 1950. So it's only about 10.9% of the long-term mean landings in the data series. Let's see. For the recreational harvest, spot declined just under 67% in 2016. The annual harvest in the recreational fishery has been below the long-term mean since 2009, and was still below that threshold in 2016, with the red proportion increasing to 62.6%, although it wasn't the second year in a row above 30, so you just get that big jump from 2016. So the recreational index actually would not have tripped, whereas the commercial one did. For the composite index, the composite characteristics showed a general decline in landings, which is primarily in recent years has been since 2008, with increasing proportions of red annually. The composite characteristic did trip in 2016 at the 30% level, its second consecutive year at 30% or greater. The increase in the red proportion is driven more by the decline in the commercial landings relative to the recreational landings. However, in 2016, they were both fairly high. And the continued declining trend in the spot fishery landings seems to be driven more by declines in the Mid-Atlantic region, which accounts for most of the commercial and recreational harvest, versus the southeast coast for the whole coastwide landings. All right, for the adult abundance indices, the NIMS index had a slight increase in 2016 from 2015. It was only 1.3%. It was still below the long-term mean, so you're still getting a little bit of red in that index, but this index wouldn't have triggered since 2003. Was the last time you had 2 consecutive years over that 30% threshold. And then the SEAMAP index declined just about 7% in 2016 and remained above that long-term mean. The SEAMAP index did not trigger either, and that one wouldn't have triggered since 2007. So both of these, while showing some slight declines in recent years from the peaks that occurred in 2012, 11, 12, 13, have been trending upward. Okay, for the composite index, the traffic light for adults showed very little change from 2015 to 2016. That slight increase in catch levels in the NIFS index was offset by the slight decrease in SEAMAP, so you're basically saying them staying about the same. So that one did not trigger in 2000. That composite would not have triggered in 2016. And then for the juvenile fish, with the Maryland survey, you see those large fluctuations in catch per unit, where you see large fluctuations in catch per unit effort, that alternating red and green. again, typical of recruitment indices young of the year fish with variable recruitment and year class strength versus what happens going on with the population. However, the index did trip at the 30% level. It's actually tripped at the 30% level in 2013-14 and at the 60% level in 2015 and 16. So this continues that, we're seeing more of the declining trend that's occurring in the Chesapeake and the Mid-Atlantic versus what we're seeing in some of the South Atlantic indices. And in the age partitioned traffic light, which I'll be showing after we get through this, we'll show some examples from the SEAMAP survey, which also shows similar decline. So to summarize for Spot, the traffic light composite indices tripped for the juvenile Spot index, but not for the adult composite characteristic. The harvest composite characteristic also triggered in 2016, mostly due to the decline we've seen in commercial landings. And then with declines in the harvest metric as well as the juvenile abundance metric that appears to be going on, there is some concern, because even though it didn't necessarily trigger that, under the what's required under the omnibus amendment, we're still seeing declining trend in multiple indices. And so with that, now that we've finished the stock assessment, that's why we've continued to try and refine the traffic light for Spot in considering additional metrics and surveys and some abundance indices. And since we're going into that next, I think I'll leave it at that, and then we'll go with questions for the traffic light, and then we can talk about the modification that we've been doing.
Okay, you want to dispense with the Croaker questions, traffic light analysis? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Is there questions about? Yes, Pat.
Thanks, Chris. It appears that your harvest indices are relatively, they're going down, but your estimates of your abundance indices are generally going up, but is there any thought about trying to examine harvest using effort? Because we've already said that effort's going down. The shrimp effort in my state alone is down about 70% in the last 20 years. So if you try to apply some kind of effort to that harvest, you may see a totally different picture, whether it be pounds per trip or pounds per license even, or pounds per vessel. But I mean, certainly we should be able to get pounds per trip and examine it as a catch per unit effort, so that we're bringing that effort, that declining effort, into that evaluation.
That's just a very good point, because we had discussed that, and we had, difficulty bringing in the trying to get some in the assessment process, trying to get some reliable effort estimates at, it was basically at the trip level for a lot of it, and that's what we were using in some cases with the shrimp trawl estimates. But depending on the gear types and everything else, effort and even at trip levels, a trip could be a day, a trip could be a week, and so it was too much uncertainty, and so but it certainly requires, would be something we should continue to look at. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Any more questions about? Yes, Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris, again, in the speculative realm, if I may head in that direction a little bit, with regard to Croaker are an extremely important species in the northern part of the normal range of the Croaker, particularly Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. They make up a very large component of the summer recreational fishery. And in recent years, my perception is that fishing's been poor for Croaker. the few croaker that have been available have been very small, generally less than the minimum size. That sort of flies in the face of the popular perception of climate change, assuming you ascribe to the philosophy that climate change is real and not fake news. So I would have expected croaker to be expanding their range to the northern part of the range due to climate change. But I'm wondering if perhaps the croaker are instead, the larger croaker, are moving offshore, hence they're being vulnerable to the NMFS trawl surveys, which of course samples a deeper water component than the recreational fishing sector is accustomed to fishing on. I just wondered if instead the croaker are heading offshore and not heading north.
That we've actually discussed that and tried teasing that out in the NMFS trawl survey data. One of the since SEAMAP has taken over the kind of the inner strata that the NMFS trawl survey used to do up to 2009, and when they switched to the Bigelow and they couldn't go in as shallow, the earlier time series you would see actually higher abundances in the shallower water where when they were still using the albatross. But the deeper strata, there was a lot more the deeper strata further out where the Bigelow, which is what we use for the NMFS index, so we can get the full use of the time series. It goes back to 1972. You do see some changes, but there was more variability in deeper out, and you don't see consistent changes with like temperature. There's been some work done by John Hare and Ken Abel looking at actually attributed low overwintering temperatures for Atlantic croaker specifically, causing higher mortality or lowering general recruitment in the spring in mid-Atlantic estuaries. But that has been the only, I think there might be one other one, I can't remember. I think Ken had another study also looking at that, but there just hasn't been much work done on whether or not they're moving out. And then even the NMFS survey only samples, let's see, they do sample deeper than the 60 meters, which I think is which that outer strata goes to. They do sample deeper than that, but the intercept for croaker at those deeper stations is pretty low, which is why we don't use them. But that's maybe, and we did have gone back and looked, I think 2 years ago, pulled some of that deeper water data again to see if there were any changes in croaker coming in, and we really didn't see. You know, it was still, you know, your positive intercepts were 5 to 10% or less for the deeper water. So if they might move out, and there are certainly years where there's more of them out there, but you know, it's probably something that needs more looking at.
Yes, sir, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in the early 2000s, I think it was 2003, 2004, in the Chesapeake Bay and maybe in a few other places, there was a die-off of large croaker in the summertime. You know, there was reports of, you know, the outgoing tide, you know, dead croaker going out through the Chesapeake Bay, the lower bay, and actually I saw it myself up there fishing during that time period. And trying to think back, I believe we saw, you know, a truncation in some of the ages and definitely in the sizes of croaker. And just thinking about the commercial fishery in North Carolina, they haven't seen those larger croakers since then. Has the TC, you know, talked about that event and how that's kind of impacted some of the trends we've seen? Because just looking at the traffic light analysis for the commercial landings, things look the best in the late 90s to about the early mid 2000s, and then you start to see red creeping in around 2006. So I didn't know if the TC talked about that possibly playing a role in some of the things that we've seen in the traffic light analysis.
We did discuss some things like the low dissolved oxygen, die-offs and things, particularly in the Chesapeake. In the last stock assessment, the 2010 stock assessment, the data we were using at that time frame, we actually started seeing an expansion of both the age and the size frequency distributions for Croaker. And then in the for this assessment going up to 2014, it seemed like it started to decrease, and then we started looking at when we incorporated looking at adding in 2015 and 2016, which of course wasn't part of the stock assessment. We've actually seen a further contraction of the size and age range going back down again, which would certainly support some of that. But I'm trying to think. We looked at, we tried to see if there was any incidents with the various indices, with like the VIMS index and the other Chesapeake juvenile indices in low DO events and that type of thing, but there wasn't really a way to, at least in the traffic light, we've certainly discussed it, but it hasn't been, we haven't been able to figure out a way to incorporate it.
Anything else on Croaker? So because both of the triggers, the composite indices, did not trip, no management action is required. I would suggest, unless there's any objection, that the TC does look into incorporating ages and possibly looking at different indices to try to improve the traffic light. And unless there is a big appetite to make changes in light of this, we'll go on to Spot. I don't see anybody with a big, we just had lunch. So are there questions about the Spot traffic light analysis? Yes, Joe.
Start by thanking everyone. I know a lot of work and very thorough. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate this whole presentation. It is eerily, at least for Spot, eerily like weak fishing. I was in your position when management board was told something very similar. Just look at trends, ignore the assessment for now. I know Jim Gilmore remembers that well too, since we were sitting up there together. So I think this is going to be a tough situation for us. And I guess three things. One, I hope that we will continue to see as much information as possible, including SEAMAP and EMAP, even if they're not necessarily incorporated into TLAs. Two, and you guys may need a crystal ball for this, I'm wondering about the TOR of including shrimp trawl into a TLA and what that would look like, what you think it might look like. And three, since this is a short-lived species and we are seeing this troubling trend in the juvenile index, is it worth updating sooner than 5 years? I mean, would it be something that we should be considering in 2 to 3 years just to see what's going on? And that would be the modified assessment. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, well, actually your first 2 points are both directly addressed in the next, when I'm talking about the age partitioning stuff as far as incorporating, right now we're looking at incorporating SEAMAP right now, not necessarily NEMAP, and then the fishery, the shrimp fishery index, well, we're going to get into it, but basically we're not necessarily recommending that be one of the traffic light triggers in and of itself, but that it be used each year as an advisory index to see, because it's going to gauge a relative impact of removals. And in the case of the way the index is calculated with the fishery, the shrimp fishery, the typically with the abundance and the harvest, higher numbers are considered good, low numbers are considered bad. In the shrimp fishery index, it's actually reversed. High numbers of bycatch is really the red proportion, and low numbers of bycatch is the green proportion. And then the, I'm sorry, what was the third point? The assessment schedule.
Right.
I would say at this point that going through the management trigger exercise, if things continue to decline and it's perceived next year, the year after, whatever, and things continue to get worse, then the board can certainly initiate an assessment sooner than the 5-year time frame. They always have that at their disposal. So I would say, we'd have to see how some of this other stuff goes, but yeah, we could always do it sooner.
Any other questions? So I would suggest, unless there's objections, that we do incorporate those extra information to the traffic light analysis, if the board is okay directing the TC to investigate that. Okay, I don't see any objections. Now we're at the point where we need to talk about acceptance of the spot stock assessment and peer review report, and I would be quite happy to listen to a motion. Oh, Tony.
Jim, since the peer review did not recommend to use the advice coming out of the assessment for management use, we generally don't actually accept it then unless the board has a different opinion, and then you can consider that.
Okay, it's up to the board. Then we would just leave it silent? Is that what we would do? Is everyone all right with that? And I assume because of that, if there's probably not an appetite here for management action either, being so we didn't trip the triggers. Seeing nothing, I guess we're done with that. Is there any other business to go before the board?
Just the update on
Oh, I'm sorry. Chris is still up. Sorry about that, Chris.
Okay. This is the last one. Y'all don't have to listen to me talk anymore. Okay, just cover real quick the age partitioned, kind of looking at this traffic light in a different way. Again, the main issue being the decline in the commercial recreational landings versus what we're seeing in the abundance indices. Most likely reason being differing size and age classes of fish captured in the different surveys, as well as what's seen in the fishery. And we did this looking at using annual age length keys applied to the total length frequency distribution data from each data set to get expanded numbers at age annually. Now I'm doing this example I'm showing you is just for croaker. We're doing the same thing for spot, but with the reduced ages we have, age availability we have with spot, we're still kind of teasing that one out. But for croaker, the ages were split between the pre-recruits, which was the ages 0 to 1, and the recruits, which would be fully recruited to fishery, which would be ages 2+. Part of the reason for doing this was because there was a bit of an overlap, particularly in the fall surveys, where you would start to catch you would be catching age 0s, and they would be similar in size range to the age 1s, and they were kind of confound each other. And so by combining the 0s and the 1s, it provides for a little better separation in the indices. Okay, next slide. We're using the same 4 fishery independent data sets, NIMS, SEAMAP, as well as North Carolina and VIMS, and the commercial and recreational harvest. And then we were also examining the two other data sets, the SEAMAP survey, as well as running the traffic light with the shrimp trawl fishery bycatch estimates. However, we didn't have size data for the shrimp fishery discards, so that was just run with total landings, since we had no way to separate that out within the age. And this is the first time that the shrimp fishery stuff has been run through the traffic light. All right, so for our harvest composite with a traffic light, the top one there, which is the age 0 to 1, showed an increase in recruitment levels observed in the early 1990s and kind of steadily increasing proportions of red, which is that declining harvest of fish in that age range, likely due to declining recruitment. And then the bottom figure, the composite traffic light for the age 2 plus, that very closely resembles the general trend seen in the overall landings. So, that appears that age 2 plus is really what's driving the harvest component for the traffic light. And higher landings seen from 96 through 2006, where you get that green in the age 0 to 1 pre-recruits, which shows up from 1990 through 99, the persistence of those throughout the fishery could be accounting for those proportions of your green you're seeing in the age 2 plus from the mid-90s to the early 2000s as they kind of work their way through the fishery over about 8 or 10 years. All right, for the fishery independent surveys, and these are mostly broken up. You'll have the non-partition one shown you, and then the partition ones on top with the partition ones below it. That non-partition traffic light shows a general increase in recent years. The age 0 to 1 was similar to that non-partition traffic light, indicating the overall trend in the catch effort was driven more by ages 0 to 1 in that particular index. And then for ages 2 plus, it shows a little bit more of a decline in that older age group that was apparent in recent years, even though you do get a couple of years in the green in 2014 and 15. And the decline that you're seeing, or you're seeing a declining trend a little bit in those age 2 plus, which is kind of what we're seeing in the commercial and recreational. For the SEAMAP survey, you still see the non-partition traffic light matched the higher degree of annual variability seen in the age 0 to 1 traffic light, as well as the increase in the trend when you look just at the ages 0 to 1 in the traffic light, that center one. You see much higher proportions of green than you do in the non-partition one. And then the magnitude of change in ages 2 plus was less than the age 0 to 1 traffic light, but it still shows some of those increases in recent years. One difference that's notable in the SEAMAP data compared to the other data sets was it had a younger maximum age of 8 versus 15, 16 in some of the mid-Atlantic surveys. And it tended to have a narrower annual size range that was consistent across the whole time period, whereas you saw increasing size range in the mid-2000s and then it declined again in later years in the mid-Atlantic. So the SEAMAP just didn't see the larger / older fish that you see in some of the other surveys. Okay, CHESMAP. One thing with CHESMAP is you see there's the catch per unit effort, which is the figure on the left, was much more pronounced for ages 2 plus, particularly due to those you get peak values from 2004 through 2007. But then the overall trends in the traffic light show the decline for Croaker in both ages 0 to 1 as well as age 2. And the catch levels were much higher in CHESMAP in the first 5 years of the survey, whereas since 2008, the catch levels have been extremely low. So the traffic light for ages 0 to 1, reflected the higher recruitment levels that we're seeing in 2005 to 2007, after which that red proportion was pretty much over 50%. And then the traffic light for ages 2 plus also showed those peak years early in the survey from 2004 to 2007, and that subsequent decline beginning in 2008, and even basically red proportion levels at 70% or greater. And that decline, particularly in SEAMAP, matches up pretty well with what's happening with the commercial and recreational landings. For the juvenile composite index, the age 0 to 1 traffic light, if you're just looking at NIMS and SEAMAP, which is that center one, because of the increases seen in that index for those younger ages, you see an even greater proportion of green for those years. And then the combination of on that bottom one, using all 4 of them, reinforce those increases that have occurred since 2011 with higher proportions of green, particularly that's SEAMAP and NEMAP kind of bringing those up in those younger fish. So the fishery-independent composite characteristic really showed the varying trends depending on the age group and which indexes were included and which years were covered, which actually just kind of adds a bit, we're still working on it, but it does add a bit of confusion to it. If we incorporate SEAMAP into that, now we're only using 2002 to 2016 because that's the time period for that survey. You see that the SEAMAP data, because of the high proportion of red, particularly in later years, is introduced into the traffic light, and so it offsets a bit of that high, that increase we were seeing in the in just the larger scale surveys, NIMS, SEAMAP, as well as the local ones in North Carolina and VIMS. Let's see. Okay, and the next one for the age 2+ data sets. You see red proportions pretty high throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. And then for the later, and then that increasing trend, even a little bit with the green showing up in that top one. And then with the addition of SEAMAP, you see those higher red proportions in all years after 2008 that more closely match, again, what we're seeing in those declines in the commercial and recreational traffic light. And so the addition of SEAMAP brought those red proportions above 30% for most years from 2008 to 2016, except for 2 years, 2014 and 15, where they were just below 30%. And so while there was a slight declining trend in the red proportions after 2008, the higher proportions of red from the addition of SEAMAP, again, ties in better with those, what we're seeing in the harvest metric. And then the shrimp fishery discards, there was, as I said, there's no length frequency data, so we ran it on the entire survey, just the discard estimates. The discards showed a high peak early in the time series, in the early 90s. The peak was 3.3 billion fish in 1991, and then values have pretty much stayed under 900 million fish per year since then. But the traffic light for using the 96 to 2008 reference period showed high proportions of red in the beginning of the time series when those when bycatch levels were fairly high. This also coincides with the time frame when bycatch reduction devices were not required, pre-1995-96. And then there were only 2 years later in the time series where that had red proportions greater than 30%, which was 2013 and 14. And so while I think I mentioned this before, answering Joe's question, the shrimp fishery traffic light gives a good estimate of general removals. Is probably better utilized as an advisory index, looked at every year as part of the trigger management exercise, but not necessarily used in and of itself as one of the actual indexes to make to decide whether or not management action is warranted. And that goes back to reliability of the estimates for the shrimp fishery estimates. So to sum everything up here, the declines in commercial and recreational harvests over the last 5-6 years have not been necessarily mirrored in the fishery independent abundance indices. The use of the age partitioned indexes did give us a little better clarification of the trends among the different indices, particularly with the harvest and abundance indices, where you see some of those more declines in those older fish, which is more reflective of what's happening in the commercial and recreational fisheries. And it also helps show us what groups are necessarily maybe driving those traffic light indices as well. The age 2+, what we're seeing is more of the decline in some of them, whereas the age 0 to 1 traffic light is behaving more like the abundance surveys. And so further refinement of the traffic light through age partitioning of the annual index catch per unit effort values, as well as the harvest estimates, could definitely provide better synchrony or agreement between the different traffic light metrics, and hopefully help account for some of the discrepancies that we're seeing between them. And then as far as the other surveys go, the SEAMAP survey would be a more appropriate addition for the traffic light at this time because it has a longer time series starting in 2002 and has a great deal of overlap already with the current reference time period, although that would be reevaluated as well. The NEMAP survey, while it does provide valuable data on abundance across a wide geographic range, still is a relatively short time frame, beginning in 2007, and does not cover a complete generation time for Croaker, which is 15 years. And then since the Atlantic Croaker do make up such a large proportion of the shrimp trawl fishery bycatch, the use of that as an advisory index with the TLA would probably be useful also, and that's something that we will continue to look at because again this is really preliminary. And with that, the questions.
Questions? Chris, thank you for all the work that you guys. That looks like you guys were on your computer a good bit, it looks like, for the last few months. Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there any other business before the board? Seeing none, we are adjourned.
We'll start ACCSP as soon as possible. And